The Weeping Walls of Blackwood Manor. The invitation. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a postman who looked as though he wanted to be rid of it as quickly as possible. The envelope was heavy, cream-colored parchment, sealed with wax the color of dried blood. It was addressed to Mr. Thomas Halloway, written in a script so jagged it seemed to have been scratched rather than penned. Thomas, a man of rational thought and meagre means, sat in his London apartment, the rain drumming a relentless rhythm against the soot-stained window. He broke the seal. The contents were brief. He had inherited Blackwood Manor, an estate in the remote moors of Yorkshire, from a great-uncle he had never known existed. "A fortune," Thomas whispered, his hands trembling slightly. "Or a burden." By Friday, he was on a train heading north. The further he travelled from London, the greyer the world became. The verdant greens of the countryside faded into the dull browns and bruised purples of the moors. The final leg of the journey required a carriage, driven by a local man who refused to make eye contact. "I'll drop you at the gate, sir," the driver muttered, pulling his coat tighter against the biting wind. "But I won't go up the drive. Not for double the fare." "Why?" Thomas asked, peering out into the gathering fog. "The Stones remember, sir, and they don't like strangers." Thomas was left standing before wrought iron gates that twisted like thorny vines. Beyond them, looming against a sky bruising with a coming storm, stood Blackwood Manor. It was a monstrosity of stone, complete with gargoyles that seemed to watch him with hollow, malicious eyes. It was not a house. It was a tomb for the living. The silence. The interior of the manor was colder than the outside. The air smelled of stale dust, damp rot, and something faintly metallic-like, old copper coins. "Hello?" Thomas's voice echoed, swallowed by the darkness of the grand foyer. There were no servants. The letter had mentioned a caretaker named Silas, but the house seemed abandoned. Thomas found a kerosene lamp on a side table, its wick trimmed and ready. He lit it, the flame casting long dancing shadows that seemed to stretch toward him. He spent the first night in the master bedroom. The bed was a four-poster beast draped in velvet curtains that smelled of mildew. Sleep did not come easily. The house was not silent. It groaned. The floorboards settled with sounds like cracking bones. Around 3 a.m. Thomas woke with a start. The silence had returned, but it was heavy now, oppressive. He lay still, his heart hammering against his ribs. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound came from inside the wall behind the headboard. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like a fingernail digging into plaster. Rats, Thomas told himself, though he didn't believe it. Rats scuttled. They didn't scratch with the slow patience of a prisoner counting days. The portrait gallery. The next morning, the fog had swallowed the world outside. Thomas decided to explore his inheritance. The library was vast, filled with books bound in leather that felt suspiciously like human skin. But it was the portrait gallery in the East Wing that drew his attention. The faces of the Blackwood ancestors lined the walls. stern men with cruel eyes and women who looked pale and terrified. At the end of the hall, covered by a dusty sheet, stood a large easel. Curiosity overcame him. Thomas pulled the sheet away. The painting was of a man who looked remarkably like Thomas himself, though older, his face twisted in a scream of eternal agony. His hands were clawing at his own throat. The plaque beneath read, "Arthur Blackwood, consumed, 1894. Consumed by what? Thomas murmured. By the debt, a voice rasped behind him. Thomas spun around, nearly dropping his lamp. Standing in the doorway was a man so old he looked like a bog mummy wrapped in tweed. His skin was grey, his eyes milky white. "You must be Silas," Thomas said, trying to steady his voice. "I am," the old man wheezed. "You shouldn't have uncovered Arthur. He doesn't like to be seen." "This house," Thomas demanded. "What is wrong with it?" Silas smiled, revealing gums black with rot. "Nothing is wrong, Mr. Halloway. The house is hungry. It hasn't been fed in 50 years. You have his blood. That is why you were called." "I'm leaving," Thomas said, stepping forward. "Prepare the carriage." "There is no carriage," Silas whispered. "The bridge washed away in the night. The moors are flooded. You are home now." The rising, damp Thomas tried to leave. He ran to the front doors, but they were locked tight. He pulled, he kicked, he screamed, but the wood held fast, hard as iron. He ran to the windows, grabbing a heavy brass candelabra to smash the glass. He swung with all his might. The glass didn't shatter. It rippled like water, absorbing the blow, then solidified again. Panic, cold and sharp, set in. He was trapped. Night fell with unnatural speed. The temperature dropped until Thomas could see his breath in the air. He retreated to the library, building a fire in the massive hearth with the dry, brittle pages of books he didn't dare read. The scratching returned. Louder this time. And it wasn't just from one wall. It was coming from the ceiling, the floor, the door. Scratch, scratch, thump. Then came the whispering. It wasn't English or Latin or any tongue of men. It was a low, guttural chanting that seemed to vibrate in his teeth. Non exieris, nos sumus hic, sanguis pro sanguine. Do not leave, we are here, blood for blood. Thomas backed away from the fire as the flames turned a sickly green. The shadows in the corners of the room began to detach themselves, elongating, forming shapes that were vaguely humanoid but horribly distorted. "What do you want?" Thomas screamed into the darkness. The answer came not from the shadows, but from the very walls of the house. You, the cellar he ran. He didn't know where, just away from the library, away from the shadows. He found himself running down the servants' stairs, deeper into the bowels of the manor. The air grew thick and wet. He reached the cellar door. It stood slightly ajar, a faint pulsating red light emanating from within. Against his will, drawn by a force he couldn't control, Thomas pushed the door open. The cellar was massive, an earthen cavern beneath the house. In the center lay a stone altar, stained dark with centuries of spills. And standing around it were the figures from the paintings, the ancestors. They were not paint and canvas anymore. They were rotting flesh and bone, their eyes glowing with the same red light. Silas stood at the head of the altar, holding a dagger made of obsidian. "The cycle must be renewed," Silas intoned. "The Blackwood line bargains with the earth. We give it life, and it gives us power. But the contract has expired." "I'm not a Blackwood," Thomas yelled, backing away until his back hit the cold dirt wall. "My name is Halloway." "Names change," Silas said, stepping closer. "Blood does not. You are the last, the closer of the circle." The rotting figures surged forward. Thomas grabbed a rusted shovel leaning against the wall and swung it, decapitating a woman in a Victorian gown. She didn't fall. Her body simply groped for the head and placed it back on her neck. They overwhelmed him. Cold, clammy hands pinned him to the altar. The smell was unbearable. Grave dirt and old blood. Silas raised the dagger. "Do not fear, Thomas. You will not die. You will simply become part of the foundation." The final stone pane, white hot and blinding, then cold. Thomas tried to scream, but he had no mouth. He tried to move his arms, but he had no limbs. He opened his eyes. He was staring into a bedroom, the master bedroom. He saw the four-poster bed, the velvet curtains. He tried to turn his head, but he couldn't. He realized with a dawning, horrific certainty that he was not in the room. He was of the room. He felt the weight of the roof above him. He felt the dampness of the rain on his outer skin. He felt the rats scuttling within his veins. The door to the bedroom opened. A young couple walked in, laughing, carrying suitcases. They looked modern, happy. "Oh, look, darling," the woman said, looking at the wall where Thomas was trapped. "This old place has such character, it feels alive." Thomas tried to warn them. He tried to scream, "Run! Get out!" But all that came out was a sound behind the plaster. Scratch! 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 The man frowned, looking at the headboard. "Did you hear that? Sounds like rats." "We'll call an exterminator in the morning," the woman laughed. Thomas wept, but no tears fell. Only a drop of condensation rolled down the cold stone wall. He was Blackwood Manor now, and he was very, very hungry.